Okay. Thank you very much, Paolo, and thanks for turning out on what seems a somewhat inclement night in these claims. And I'm not going to try your patience any further, given the fact that we've been delayed so much in getting here. So I won't give you maybe the full edition of an explanation about the book that I've done in other meetings, including last night. But I do still want to go over some issues as to why I wrote it and some of the issues that underlie it that I think are very important. And in one respect, I suppose you could say that the motivation behind writing the book was to try and bring together some of the experience I've accumulated, as well as then study for myself further into information and apply that knowledge and experience to socialist ideas and to apply socialist theory to living realities in order to help equip people in the day-to-day struggles to change the world we live in, starting here in Scotland. Now that in itself is quite a grandiose sound name, but to break it down, I think we live in a society where unfortunately we're absolutely consumed by individualism and by the feeling that it's the great I am, and that there's no such thing as society, and that fame is a success in its own self and stuff like that. And some of the collectivism of the past, including, for example, when I was an extremely young man, as opposed to a young man like I am now, then some of the collectivism expressed through mass trade union organisation, expressed through mass political protest and big political parties of the left, some of that suffered immensely in more recent decades, but some of it is beginning to revive on a slow basis. And I think a key task is to help equip people, young people included, with a knowledge of the root causes of the inequality and poverty that blight society, but also with a vision of what could be if it was organised differently, and to learn from lessons of history, including recent history, and to be inspired by examples of struggle as well as be angered by examples of reality. That's some of the purposes behind this book in a more general sense. And to put it another way again, the book has been born just before Christmas, but it was actually an actual traditional pregnancy for the human lifespan, because it took me 9 months to actually get it produced. Now that wasn't 9 months of continuous gestation and nourishment, it was an hour here and there because of work and commitments to political campaigning and daily life and family life and serialised illnesses as well, actually, of different kinds that interrupted it all. But eventually it was written. It started out with the aim of being a pamphlet in favour of the £10 minimum wage. But what I increasingly decided, without ever actually planning to write a book, and that's honest, what I increasingly discovered was that there was issues related to the £10 minimum wage campaign that meant it would be wrong to just leave that in splendid isolation, because otherwise it wouldn't actually explain properly the thinking behind that particular demand and policy that the Scottish Socialist Party has been pioneering. And that expanded into other areas like Paolo has touched upon. But in a sense, the origins of the book, you could say, go back as far as things like the 1870s, although I wasn't there. The 1870s, when there was the early birth of some of the trade union movement, and the struggle for the living wage began to be raised by trade unionists in that period. Or the National Anti-Sweating League, which was taking up the struggle to organise the most unorganised and super exploited in the sweated trades in that period. Or more relative recent history, the tradition of the 1931 Living Wage Bill that was presented to Parliament by the Independent Labour Party, Red Clydesiders like Jimmy Maxton and company. And also, of course, the 1970s, when there was a big struggle for a national minimum wage, a legally enforced minimum wage, taken up by initially unions in the most difficult to organise and downtrodden sections of workers, such as NUPE, which is the National Union of Public Employees. And as a child of the time, obviously he'll stick to that story, I will, I mean. But as a child in the 1970s, of course, I was witness to the struggles, the campaigning around the idea of a national minimum wage. An idea that at first did not have majority support in the trade union movement, actually. As I've described in the book itself, you can read more about it. I'm only going to give you tasters. I'm not going to try and speak the book. But although sometimes some people have said, in fact a large number of them, that when they read it, they hear me speaking. Someone's doing the accent, I think. But the thing is that we live in a society here and now, which I've described in the opening line of chapter 1, in this sentence, that Scotland, the face of Scotland, is scarred by poverty and inequality, like a pair of poisonous pluges. And I think that captures the starting point of what we're about in this book and what we want to do with it, what we want to use it for. Because it's to recognise the realities of absolutely obscene levels of inequality. Another phrase I've used in the book that a friend who's an artist and filmmaker actually did a review for me, a brief review, and he quoted this sentence as one he loved because of his poetry, so to speak. But it's the idea that when workers are swimming in a sea loch of poverty, barely able to keep their chins above water, they're surrounded by mountains of wealth that make Ben Nevis look like a puny molehill. That's as far as I can remember how it's written. And that, to me, is the starting point. The disgusting, obscene levels of inequality, and it's in a country that's absolutely swimming in wealth. It's not as if it even has got the feeble excuse of being a basket case economy without the ability to provide for its people. And then we have to look at the root causes. And that's what the book in some ways concentrates upon. Because it's not enough to just describe the obscenities of life as in economic deprivation alongside inglorious wealth accumulated for the 1%. It's necessary to understand where that's come about, how it's come about, if we're going to tackle the root causes and overcome the subsequent inequalities and repression that exists. Because today is the product of particularly the past 40 years of a systematic crusade to redistribute wealth upwards. There was an infamous theory that I've made some passing comment on in the book, the trickle-down theory. Now, it's the first time in modern society that gravity has been defied by economics, because there has been a trickle of wealth, in fact a flood of wealth, but it's been upwards. That's where the trickle has gone, the flood has gone upwards to the top of society, to the extent that, for example, wages as a share of gross domestic product are at their lowest ever since records began in 1956. One of the figures I've used is that by weird coincidence, just as those £1.3 trillion handed out from public funds to bail out the banks in 2008, exactly the same amount of money has been robbed from wages in the past 30 years, according to studies by various, including bodies for the TUC. £1.3 trillion. And that means, in the analogy I've used, or the metaphor I've used quite frequently in the book, which my dentist would have something to say about, and that's the analogy of a cake. But the cake of national wealth has grown massively in its circumference and size. It's doubled actually in the last 30 years. But the slice going to the plates of the working class has become thinner and thinner, and therefore actually has become less in reality. So we've seen a society where a whole succession of political decisions motivated by class interests of the rich has driven down the share of wealth going to wages and to the social wage, which again is referred to and described within the book in the form of public services and so on. And that war on wealth by the rich against the working class majority is at the heart of the inequality we suffer today and the levels of downright deprivation. And of course, as I've described in the book, there's the poverty denying brigade, the Tories in particular, big business in general. And the Tories, of course, try to rewrite the rules of poverty. Even the House of Lords took umbrage at their methods yesterday, where they overturned a clause within the replacement for the Child Poverty Act, where the Tories are trying to redefine child poverty by saying it's got nothing to do with your income. It's purely to do with the levels of unemployment, or worklessness as they call it, in the family, and levels of drug and alcohol addiction. In other words, what they're trying to do is to blame the victims of poverty by attacking them for some of the symptoms of poverty, and meantime increase the levels of poverty but behind the backs of society. That's the motivation behind that type of legislation, for example. And you could go on all night, and I promise not to, with other examples and symptoms of the same process and the same class features that exist in society. And I suppose at the heart of what I've tried to do is to either revive the awareness with modern examples from daily life for stalwarts and veterans of the struggle, or introduce newcomers to the trade union and socialist movement, and to life in general, to the concepts of socialism that are absolutely applicable and irreplaceable in understanding the life that we're living in. For example, the whole idea that the fundamentals of this kind of system, capitalism, is class and class exploitation. The fundamentals that whilst there's additional forms of repression, that class is at the heart of it. The fundamentals that inequality and poverty derives from the unpaid labour of the working class, from the system described in the word profit. That is what I attempt to describe, illustrate and back up, not only with startling, jaw-dropping statistics, there's plenty of them in this book, but also life examples. And I'm not going to spoil any of your reading if you've not started by going through the details of stories in it. But one that I'm particularly, I suppose, attached to is the way I described the sources of profit by illustrating them from the life, the early life of my own father, where, you know, at the age of 10, he was hired at the hiring fairs in County Cavan before he subsequently migrated to Fermanagh, where I'm from. And I won't go into the full story, but it's there in the book to illustrate nakedly what profit is, what capitalism is, and why it is that we've got class division within the society. And as an aside, in a poignant, weird coincidence, the printers rang me to say the first print run was available on the 3rd of December, the 6th anniversary of the death of my father, who I dedicated the book to amongst other people in the family. But as I described him, a man they hired but could not buy, because he stood by principle. I'm not claiming he was a socialist, but he rebelled against the rich and hated the big landowning class that exploited him in his own childhood. So that is an issue, a theme throughout the book. And I've tried to provide activists with arguments, as well as stories and statistics that underline the case for socialism. I've tried to provide arguments against the doubters, the genuine doubters, the people you meet in work or in your union branch, or when you try to recruit them to socialism, who say things like, but surely society couldn't afford that, or business would go bust, or small businesses would collapse, or is it not just that there's too many immigrants that causes the low wages? And I've dealt with all those issues and others in some substantial detail, with a lot of research and real people's lives and examples in the most of them as well. I'm trying to overcome the predominant philosophy that there is no alternative, because there's a whole concept that I've again put into the book, that there's the basic socialist theory that the dominant ideas of any society are the ideas of the dominant class, the ruling class. And that was expressed, for example, in the ideas that the likes of Thatcher especially expressed of there is no alternative. He was even given the acronym TINA to try and browbeat us into submission, that there's no point in protesting against the ills of society because it's always going to be like that, that's how it should be. And I've tried to counter that with, amongst other things, examples of inspiring struggle that have succeeded, but also painting a picture of what might be and what could be. And at the heart of the whole thing is trying to not just justify the case for a £10 minimum wage, or the abolition of 0 hour contracts, or the crusade against casual labour in general, or for secure jobs and the job creation schemes, but to go beyond wages towards socialism as one of the chapters titled, to go through a whole series of other issues that are connected with it. For example, the lunacy of capitalism, that means there's people who are driven to the brink of insanity because of the stress of overwork, and then there's people suffering all sorts of mental illnesses and conditions as a result of having no work and no ability to have a sense of value in life by contributing to society through their skills being applied through a job. And that craziness expressed through the long hours culture, at the same time as we have massive levels of underemployment and unemployment, is something that I've tried to tackle and tie it in and knit it in with things like new technology. Now, those that know me well are aware of the fact that I'm not exactly a genius of new technology. In fact, some of this book has been lost forever, although it turns out it wasn't my fault, but just disappeared into cyberspace. Even the Apple experts couldn't discover why or how to recover it. So, new technology, nevertheless, is something that could be applied to become the friend of people and planet, instead of being yet another modern chain used to tie people up in knots in further levels of increased unemployment or increased overwork or increased poverty and inequality. So this book goes well beyond the immediate issues of wages towards an explanation of the fundamentals of capitalist workings or not workings and capitalist society, and why it is we therefore arrive at a situation of 1 million people in poverty in Scotland, in one of the richest nations on earth. And I suppose to conclude then, for me the purpose of writing the book was to equip people with a toolkit in some respects, not to dictate everything you think, but to provoke thought, and to have people provided with a treasury of facts, statistics and arguments that, if they accept and they digest, can then be applied. Because there's frankly no point in being a socialist if you don't persuade others of being a socialist. Socialism will only come about by mass movements of ordinary people. And it won't necessarily happen tomorrow in Scotland, unfortunately, but it takes that tenacity of having an understanding of the nature of society and a vision of a new society if you're going to succeed in motivating and mobilising masses of people. And therefore, my appeal, and my intention I should say, was to have something that was accessible to people, that explains socialist theory, but in the language of everyday living experience, and not the dry academic stuff that accumulates dust in the back rooms of either bookshops or libraries. Now, having said that, I want it to be a reference book in every sense of that word. In fact, it's going to be a reference book in the Mitchell Library in Glasgow, you'll be pleased to know. I've negotiated an arrangement where there'll be a reference copy, and there'll be at least initially a copy to be borrowed in the libraries of Glasgow. And I want that to be replicated elsewhere. We want it to be accessible in every sense of the word, which is why we kept it down to a daft cheap price, frankly, so as to make it accessible to people. But the judgment of that is the reaction of people that have read it or read parts of it already. I can't be the judge of that, frankly. It's very difficult. I'm too close to it still to even read it in the proper sense. I tried after Christmas and started looking for full stops and commas. Instead of actually reading the English, I was reading the words, if you get me distinction. So I'm not the best judge of that, but I did my best to make it accessible in its language and make it colourful where I could and so on, so it wasn't just dry, boring and put down as quick as you can. And the thing that's encouraged me, I have to say, and I suppose give me a sense that it was worth the effort in between all those things I was doing, at God knows how many different times of the day that I was writing or researching, then the thing that's been reassuring is the reaction, the responses of working class people in particular, who have read some or all of it. There's people who have said things like, I've finished it. There's a working class woman, a nurse. I've finished it and I'm just furious. I'm furious and I want to do something about it. Or there's the forklift driver that I know, a Polish worker, who volunteered when I was doing some union work at my own place. I've started reading your book, Richie. I really like it. It's dead easy to read. He's Polish, second language English. That's reassuring. Or the fact that Another woman in Oslo said, that's my union, said, I love its style, it's humorous but informative. Or the train driver who said, you know, it's absolutely packed full of indisputable information, but above all it's readable, and I intend to flog some more to other ASLEF members, and I give him 4 more that he's got orders for yesterday. Or the fact that one of the leaders of the RMT in Scotland, of the CalMac workers, this was in a phone call and then he wrote a version of it for a review for a newspaper, said, Richie, it's not that I'm blowing smoke up your arse, a metaphor that I've only recently discovered. I'm very innocent that way. But he says, I'm not blowing smoke up your arse, but it's the most inspiring thing I've read since The Ragged Trouser Philanthropist. Yeah. Now that's what he said. That's not my judgment. Ragged Trousers Philanthropist was a totally different book for stars, a novel. Mine's all fact. But the thing is that that in itself, which he meant, in itself is a judgment that kind of reassures me, not to mention boost me morale a bit. And the fact that also at another range, I've mentioned this filmmaker stroke artist that praised it for its contents and the fact that it should become a tool for anybody that wants equality in society, was his phrase. Or the last example I'll use is the fact that an Oslo shop steward that I know rather well, he said, it's not me like, he says, I've read this, half of it so far. I used to be the SNP candidate a few years back. I left the SNP because I'm a socialist. I rejoined in the aftermath of the referendum with tens of thousands of others. After reading this, I've re-examined my politics. He's left the SNP last week. He's discussed with me and he's now voting for us in his region, the West region of Scotland, in the forthcoming election. Good. I've suggested there's a home for him in the form of the Scottish Socialist Party, pro-independence, socialist. He says, I'll go cold turkey for a while, but then I'll talk to you again. That's an indication that's had an impact, at least on that scattering of examples that I've described. And I'll conclude by saying this. I don't have this habit that some have of quoting themselves in the third person. Donald J. Trump, even Arthur Scargill, I have to say. I was at rallies during the miners' strike where Arthur would get up and he'd start telling hilarious stories. And he would start then talking about Arthur Scargill. I used to find that quite bizarre, I have to say. So I'm not going to start saying, and Richie Venton says, or wrote. I'm just going to quote a couple of short paragraphs from towards the end of the book that try to encapsulate the conclusions I would ask you to consider drawing. And I wrote towards the end that societies have only ever been fundamentally changed by the vision of pioneers who succeed in welding their ideas to active, determined movements of masses of people. Words have to become deeds to effect change. Struggle without clear aims and alternatives is a futile waste of human dedication. Ideas without active struggle and engagement with broad masses, nowadays of the working class majority population, are a self-indulgent waste of talent. And I've come across plenty of that during my lifetime. But then, the heart of the conclusion of Break the Chains, and of me, if you want to put it that way, and of the SSP, and I hope of every one of you and others, is that, to quote, those who want to eradicate poverty and inequality need to square up to the conclusion that trying to do this on any lasting basis without also toppling the capitalist despots from their boardroom thrones is as futile as trying to rub out your own shadow on a sunlit day. And my ambition in this book, you can judge whether I succeed, is to cast a light on the whole edifice and system of capitalism, and of course it'll cast a shadow, but the only way to rub out the shadow of capitalism in the form of things like poverty and inequality is to topple the actual edifice, the system itself, and bring about a new socialist society. I hope it contributes to that, but if you do what others are doing, buy it, read it, sell it to others, order copies for your union branch as others have done already, then hopefully it'll be one small contribution to bring about a society worthy of humanity in the 21st century. Thanks for listening.